This lecture, I'd like to consider issues to do with hypnosis being an altered state. So hypnosis can be thought of as involving two phenomena, in a way. One is that when suggestions are given, like, say, magnetic hands, that the subject has changes in their experience, so that normally volitional actions are experienced as involuntary, and imagination is experienced as reality. So in the case of magnetic hands, I can feel a magnetic force pulling my hands together, so I have a change in my sense of volition and reality in responding to a suggestion, a self-given suggestion in this case. So that's one issue, and that's the issue to do with response to suggestion, the ability of the hypnotizable subject to change their sense of volition and reality as they strategically find appropriate. But there's also a separate issue of whether there's a special altered state or trance that goes with that ability to respond to suggestion and maybe facilitates or in some ways causal in bringing about that response to suggestion. Now, the claim of the altered state may be right or might be wrong, quite separate from the ability of particularly highly hypnotizable people to change their perceptions of reality and volition. So what I want to address in this lecture is the question of there being an altered state. And just remember, whatever we conclude about that, for example, if at the end of the lecture or the end of your reading on this topic you decide there isn't a special altered state to do with hypnosis, that isn't debunking the phenomenon of hypnosis more generally, because there's still the other side of hypnosis, which is the response to suggestion, which may occur quite independently of there being an altered state. But anyway, a common belief about hypnosis is that a hypnotized subject is in a trance, and along with that, there is a special induction procedure that produces this trance or altered state of consciousness in which subjects are especially suggestible. So that's the claim I'd like to consider. It's a notion about hypnosis that's suggested by the way we speak. We talk about a person being under hypnosis, implying that there's a state that they're in. We talk about a person being hypnotized, implying they've been put into a special state. The use of the term induction implies we've induced a state, and so on. So the everyday language we have about hypnosis is clearly derived from a theory of there being a trance-like state in which response to hypnotic suggestion is presumably facilitated. So if there is a state which can be induced, presumably there's something special or something you need to do to induce that state. So I'd like to consider what are hypnotic inductions, what do they achieve, and what does a procedure need to be in order to induce hypnosis, in order to be a hypnotic induction. And I'd also like to consider if there are any special physiological, behavioral or other markers of a hypnotic trance state. So taking the first question first, what do hypnotic inductions achieve and what makes something a hypnotic induction? So let's start with what you might call the standard hypnotic induction. It's the one, something like the words here are used in the majority of inductions, hypnotic inductions, in an academic or clinical context. Essentially, they involve repeated statements that you're becoming more and more relaxed, more and more sleepy, and more hypnotized. So, for example, relax more and more. As you think of relaxing, your muscles will relax. Starting with your right foot, relax the muscles of your right leg. Now the muscles of your left leg. Just relax all over. Relax your right hand, your forearm, upper arm and shoulder. That's it. You're relaxed, very relaxed. And, well, you can read it in your time later. So it goes on. So the particular words here aren't important. You can vary this as you please, but traditionally they include reference to being sleepy, drowsy, relaxed, and repeated suggestions that you're drifting into some sort of special state, which we could call hypnosis. So now, an induction like that might last 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And in a normal procedure, after you've given that induction, you give some suggestions. So in this particular experiment, an unselected group of subjects, by unselected I mean there were a group of undergraduates at the university these researchers came from. They hadn't been selected for the hypnotizability beforehand. So there'll be a mixture of people who don't really respond to hypnosis and people who do. And they were given 7 suggestions. And in one condition, these 7 suggestions were given without any induction. So people just sit down and then you just launch into suggestions. For example, you say, put your hands out in front of you, palms facing each other. That's good. Now, imagine your hands are like magnets. You can feel the magnets pulling your hands closer and closer together. Your hands are moving closer and closer together, and so on. So out of the 7 suggestions, when no induction is given, if we average over everybody, some people responded to all of them, some to none of them, but on average, people responded to 2.5 of the suggestions. Now, there's another condition in which an induction was first given. Now, I wonder what your intuitions are about how many suggestions out of 7 would now be passed when we've added the standard hypnotic induction. So 2.5 out of 7 passed without the induction. Just tell the person next to you, how many suggestions do you think are passed with the induction? Just tell the person, just a gut reaction. Right, now, I probably wouldn't ask you if there wasn't going to be some surprise in there. I think there's going to be a surprise in there. But does anyone want to volunteer a number? A rough guess?
5.
5. That sounds like a very plausible number. In fact, it's 3. So 5 was the sort of number I was hoping you were saying each other, so I could surprise you. And tell you it's only on average half a suggestion more. So yes, the induction did increase response to suggestions, but I think by a rather tiny amount. You go up from 2.5 to 3. And then if you look at the distribution, so these are participants, they were both in a condition with an induction, without an induction, and this is how much they improved with the induction. It was half on average. But the average is averaging over all these differences you see here. So for most people, the induction didn't make any difference whatsoever. Yes, there were a number of people where it did make a difference, including a person here whose response increased by 5 suggestions. But there are some people over here whose response actually went down after the induction. So it's not as if the induction is producing some very different state in the sense that it's associated with a large and reliable increase in suggestibility. The standard hypnotic induction increased responding by only a small amount, about half a suggestion out of 7 on average. And another point, and I'm basing this claim here not just on this study but on other studies, the induction does not enable the subject to respond to any suggestion they could not have responded to anyway. So a highly hypnotizable person can respond to even the most difficult suggestions like hallucination, like seeing the pink elephant in the room there, whether or not they've had an induction. So I remember sitting in a cafe with a person who I happened to know was highly hypnotizable, and I said, you see that bottle in front of you, you could turn that red if you wanted to. And she said, no, really? And I said, go on then. And she said, my God, it's just turned red. So she had the ability to produce the hallucination with no induction, except she didn't know that she had that ability, but she did as a highly hypnotizable person. So that's the first point I want you to bear in mind about inductions, is they don't actually achieve very much. They achieve something, but not very much. But let's just juxtapose that claim, because I don't want to this following claim, because I don't want you to forget that highly hypnotizable people can achieve some remarkable things. And I just want to illustrate that with the Stroop effect. So what happens with the Stroop effect is you see some words, say on a computer screen. Your job is to ignore what the word is saying and just to say what colour is the word being presented in. So what you should say here is blue, red, black. Okay. Now that's easy in this case. This is the congruent case because the meaning of the word which you're meant to be ignoring happens to match the colour that you're meant to be saying. But it's particularly difficult in the incongruent case because the meaning of the word that you're meant to be ignoring is a colour word, but is different from the colour word that you're meant to be saying. And then neutral, lamp isn't a colour or much to do with colours. Now the Stroop interference effect is the fact that people are slower in the incongruent condition compared to the neutral condition. Amir Raz had the idea of giving the suggestion to highly hypnotizable people that when they look at the computer screen, they'll see a meaningless script in another language. In fact, it was English words, and these were English-speaking people. And they were asked to say what colour was the script being presented in. So the question is, what would happen to the Stroop effect when you've given the hypnotic suggestion that effectively the person will not read the words because the words will appear as meaningless. Now my prediction would have been in this case that you would still get the Stroop effect. The reading of words is an automatic process that's very hard to stop. So if you look at a word on the screen here like this one, just look at it and try not to read it. It's difficult, right? The meaning just comes to you whether you want it to or not. So the question is, would a hypnotic suggestion that effectively you wouldn't be able to read the words stop people from reading the words as shown by reduction in the Stroop effect? And indeed that's what he found. So this is the Stroop interference effect here in a control condition with no suggestion. 0 would mean you took you had the same reaction time in the incongruent as in the neutral condition. And what this is telling you that subjects are a bit more than 100 milliseconds slower in the incongruent condition than the neutral condition, and that's the Stroop interference effect. So that's with no suggestion, this block here. This is when they're given a suggestion and you see this quite large reduction in the Stroop effect. And that's a reduction I didn't quite believe until I set about replicating it, and we've replicated it several times here at Sussex. So the hypnotic suggestion that the subject cannot read the words reduces the Stroop effect. So this seems to be a remarkable effect of having a sort of negative hallucination. So remember, a negative hallucination is the suggestion you'll not perceive something that is there. In this case, you're not perceiving meaning. Or you're not perceiving it in some full and complete way, in that you're not getting the Stroop interference. So this seems like a powerful effect of hypnosis. And this was achieved by first giving a hypnotic induction and then the suggestion. So then the question arises, well, what would happen if we didn't give the induction? Let's say we just gave the suggestion. So that's what Raz et al. Did in a subsequent paper. And you can see here, with the induction, the Stroop effect is about halved, and that's typical in other papers. There's been, as I say, a number of papers, including papers from here, that have looked at this effect. Halving the Stroop effect is typical. But we don't need the induction to achieve that. Just the suggestion by itself will halve the Stroop effect as well. So the induction appears to add nothing to what is an ability of high hypnotizable people to transform the way they perceive the world. Some earlier work had looked at whether hypnotic suggestions might not give people abilities they don't have, for example, with strength or endurance. So if you get people to perform some endurance task, maybe like squeezing these grip things repeatedly, or seeing how much weight they can lift. And some early studies said you give people induction, they can do more. But that turned out to be an effect you could easily replicate just by motivating people. So the induction acted as an extra motivation, and all you needed to do to replicate the small increase that the induction gave was to say to people, now I know you can do more, try harder, and then you got the same effects. So the hypnotic induction doesn't seem to create a state in people that gives them any abilities that they didn't have otherwise. I want to consider in another lecture, because there's been extensive investigation of the matter, and in these two further areas, and it's rather clinically important, that those are the areas of memory and pain. Specifically, can you use hypnotic suggestions to improve people's memory so that they can recall or recognize information better than they could do otherwise, better than they could do without hypnosis? And can you, by giving a hypnotic induction, enable people to overcome pain in a way that they couldn't do without the induction? So that will be next week. We consider those issues. The issue to do with pain is somewhat controversial in that some people claim the induction does give you a small increase in ability to deal with pain, and other people claim that it doesn't. But other than that controversy there, I think a pretty good summary of the evidence in all sorts of areas is that an induction does not give you any ability to do anything that you couldn't do otherwise. And where there is controversy, say in the case of analgesia, in other words pain relief, if an induction does do something, it's small. So people who can respond to hypnotic suggestions, including for pain relief, can relieve pain to a very large degree even without an induction. So the traditional relaxation induction increases suggestibility only by a small amount. And that amount, that small increase that it does have, for example, I said half a suggestion increase on average over a range of suggestions, is matched by a corresponding increase in expectations by subjects that they will respond to the suggestions. In other words, if you ask people how strongly do you expect to respond to a hypnotic suggestion, either without giving a hypnotic induction and then you launch into the suggestions, or after you've given induction, people's expectations will be increased because they've had an induction. So it's just possible that the increase in performance that you get is caused by the increase in expectation. In other words, it's because people expect to respond more strongly that they do respond that little bit better. So I raise that as a conjecture because that's not a conclusion in the field. That's a point of debate. But it remains a possibility. So it would be the simplest explanation of what an induction is doing. The other explanation is that it's producing some special state which is causal in enhancing response to suggestion. Now, if it was just expectation, then it wouldn't matter what the form of the induction was, as long as the subject believed that this was an effective procedure for inducing hypnosis. In other words, as long as the subject took it to be a hypnotic induction. So let's look at the evidence for the effectiveness of different types of procedures labelled as inductions. Now, the first thing to consider is whether hypnosis has anything to do with physical relaxation and sleep. Because the traditional induction contains repeated suggestions of becoming more and more sleepy and drowsy. Indeed, the word hypnosis comes from the Greek for sleep. And so there is, at least in terms of our cultural beliefs about the nature of hypnosis, this association between hypnosis and sleep. So Banyai, the Hungarian, and Ernst Hilgard thought, well, let's do the opposite. Instead of using induction that says you're becoming more and more sleepy, let's put people on stationary bicycles. Wherever it says sleepy and drowsy, we'll say more and more alert. And we'll have them keep pedaling on those bicycles as they respond to the suggestions. So we can be quite sure that these people are not sleepy or drowsy or physically relaxed. So they called this the active alert induction. And the number of suggestions passed out of 8 was non-significantly different between the active alert and the traditional procedure. A result that has been replicated and taking the evidence together, there's pretty good evidence for there being no difference between an active induction and a traditional induction. So the message to take home from this is that the relaxation and drowsiness and sleep aspect that we associate with hypnosis has nothing to do with hypnotic responding. You don't need to be sleepy or drowsy at all. Indeed, one reason for thinking, even before this study was done, or that this was an important study to do, that sleepy and drowsiness isn't important, is considering, say, a post-hypnotic suggestion. So post-hypnotic suggestion Remember, it's a suggestion like, say, in the future, maybe when you hear a knock, you'll scratch your right eyebrow. And the highly hypnotizable subject will respond effectively to that and have the experience of an itchy eyebrow that they scratch when they hear a knock. Even when they've come out of hypnosis, if that's the correct way of speaking, so they're not sleepy or drowsy at all, but they're still responding quite effectively to the post-hypnotic suggestion. Another reason for thinking sleepiness isn't much to do with it. Remember, I said in the previous lecture that once a person has experienced hypnosis, I think I said this previous lecture, by giving a long induction, you don't need to give a long induction again. You can just say to people, now you are hypnotized. In clinical practice, that's often what you do. You give a long, say, 15-minute induction in the first instance, but you say, in the future, I don't need to go through with that procedure. When I say now you're hypnotized, you'll be hypnotized, and that's quite sufficient. I don't know who here has heard of NLP or Neurolinguistic Programming. Does that mean anything to people? So this was a sort of a way of, a set of procedures, concepts, techniques that was initially derived from results from academia, but then took on a life of its own and became divorced from the critical scientific tradition of testing all claims that are made. And in that sense, it sort of became a cult. It was divorced from the critical tradition, basically. So claims were made that were not critically scrutinized and tested. It was originally devised as a clinical practice, and they said that they modeled their procedures on famous hypnotherapists like Milton Erickson and some other people, but Milton Erickson, who was a hypnotherapist, was a big influence. And when controlled studies showed that the clinical procedures weren't any more effective than any others, despite claims to the contrary, it sort of became a management practice and involved management consultancy and helping people in their business. And I guess in that environment, what is selected for are not claims that pass rigorous and, if not hostile, experimentation, which is what happens in the scientific arena, but claims that will go down well in a workshop with you being a consultant. And that probably isn't a very good environment for selecting and developing claims about human psychology. So the founders of NLP said that they had a developed induction called the double induction, which was one of the most powerful induction and deepening techniques. It involved the subject hearing two things at once. In one ear they heard a hand levitation suggestion. Your hand is becoming lighter and lighter. It's rising, rising. Your hand is rising. And in the other ear, hearing sort of childish gibberish to confuse the conscious and allow you to talk directly to the unconscious. So it was claimed. Well, this might sound good, but sounding good isn't the actual test of whether something is true about how the human mind works. What we need to do is an experiment, a set of experiments. So Matthews et al. Tested people, undergraduates were either given the double induction or the standard induction, and got no significant difference. Indeed, in terms of the sample means here, the double induction was slightly less effective than the standard induction. Milton Erickson also suggested that one way to improve the way suggestions are typically given is to put them in a more indirect way. So a direct suggestion is something like, your hand will rise in the air. You feel it getting lighter and lighter. You're told directly what you experience and what will happen. The indirect suggestion is meant to undercut a person's resistance to being controlled. Say a person says, you will not control me. So my mind is my own. So what you do is you say, I don't know if your hand is getting lighter or not. Just pay attention to your hand and see if you feel any feelings. Maybe it's getting lighter. I don't really know. So that's an indirect suggestion, because it's saying maybe something is true, maybe it isn't. Why don't you have a look and see? Now, I think in a clinical context that might be an interesting and useful piece of advice for dealing with particular situations. But let's say you take a set of undergraduates and give them either a direct procedure, induction and suggestions, as is typically done, or indirect, then you don't get significant differences between the two types of procedures. So what else would form an induction? Well, a sugar pill with the word hypnosis on it is just as effective as a standard hypnotic induction. Or some gas with a medicinal smell to it that you tell subjects will put them in a hypnotic state. That's just as good as a standard induction. Indeed, we only need to go back to William James and his textbook of psychology written in 1890. He has a chapter on hypnosis, and he lists a whole host of procedures that are effective as inductions. Looking at a bright button, making passes over the body, stroking the head, staring into the eyes, look at my eyes, just my eyes, drinking magnetized water, a blow on a gong, gong, pressure on the foreheads or thumbs, even in those days, writing someone a letter and ordering them to sleep. So all I can conclude, I think, from all of these procedures is an induction is anything the subject believes is an induction. Now, I think that's useful to know. So what can we conclude from that? Well, it could be the expectation story is true. As long as we increase subjects' expectations that they'll respond to suggestions, then we've fulfilled the function of the induction as standardly employed. There is another story we could tell, though, and that is there is a special state of hypnosis, but we don't need any special procedure to induce it. It's a state that a highly hypnotizable person knows about. Because they're highly hypnotizable, they've probably experienced it in their life, and all they need to know is this is an appropriate context for bringing about that state. So once you've told them, you know that state you can go into where you can respond easily to suggestions, well, I want you to do it now. I regard that as quite possible. But it is useful to know that we don't need any special procedure to do that. We just need to alert the person, now's the time and place for you to go into that special state. And nothing more is needed than that. So we could still have a trance theory, but it's a trance that the highly hypnotizable person can put themselves in or take themselves out of any time that they please. So if there was a hypnotic state or a trance, we might expect there to be some markers of it. ultimately we require some markers of it for it to be a proper scientific theory. Otherwise, it's just a word. And the short answer is that there are no physiological markers of a hypnotic state that we have detected yet. People have, over the decades claimed various things, maybe alpha or theta rhythms, but there are no alpha, theta, or other brain waves that are special to hypnotic responding. You can increase your alpha just by closing your eyes and relaxing. That's not to do with hypnosis. And theta is just to do with concentrating. And one thing I can tell you that fits the active alert induction results we got earlier is if you put a EEG on people, we measure the brain waves. Sleep has a very distinctive pattern, and hypnosis is nothing like that. So when we use EEG and look at people after an induction, we don't see any special state, and it's nothing like sleep. So in a way, really, we should stop using the word hypnosis, which means sleep in Greek. And indeed, in medicine, still means sleep or going unconscious. We're sort of stuck with the word, I guess, but it's a bad word. And what we would really want, by the way, when you do this sort of research, is not, if you're looking for some special mark of hypnosis, we would want that state to be there whether we did a traditional sleep relaxation type induction or we did an active alert induction, right? So we do any of the inductions that are meant to induce hypnosis, this special marker should be there for all of them, for all those inductions that work. Otherwise, we might be picking up on something that's just about being drowsy and sleepy because we just use the traditional induction. Well, people have claimed that the hypnotic state is something to do with the left and right hemispheres, and maybe particularly a shift towards a greater reliance on the right hemisphere. But there's no asymmetries in activation of left and right hemispheres that's special to hypnotic responding, as measured by EEG. And a recent paper by John Kilström that was particularly interesting. He looked at people who had strokes and hence brain damage in just the left hemisphere or just the right hemisphere, because if hypnosis was special to the work of one hemisphere rather than another, it should be if you've, say, had a stroke in the right hemisphere, you should be less hypnotizable. But they couldn't find any difference in hypnotizability, no matter whether the people had brain damage in the left or the right hemisphere. Well, especially the last 10, 20 years, brain scanning techniques have been developed, and one of the good things about that is they've produced a resurgence of interest in hypnosis, probably because of the notion of hypnosis as a special state and the idea, well, let's scan the brain and see what's happening. But no brain imaging using fMRI or other technologies has revealed a special marker of hypnosis. But it's early days, and maybe some marker will be shown. There is a set of recent findings that have been consistent in showing that after hypnotic induction, there's a reduction in activity called the default mode network. So the default mode network is a system of connectivity in the middle parts of the brain rather than the lateral or edge parts out here. That's particularly active when you're daydreaming, recollecting things, thinking about things, rather than concentrating on the world right now. And when you concentrate on the world right now, the activity shifts from the default mode to the lateral parts of the brain. So some papers have found a reduction in default mode activity after hypnotic induction. It's not a special marker of hypnosis, though, because, as I say, the activity in that network goes up or down depending on how much you're daydreaming or attending to the world. So after hypnotic induction, when highly hypnotizable people are sitting there, maybe they're attending to the hypnotist and ready for the suggestion. And that's all that means. So it doesn't seem to me yet that this gives us any strong hope for there being a mark of a special trance state. Now, there are altered states of consciousness. It's not as if altered states of consciousness don't exist. There are altered states of consciousness, and we can induce them, and they can make people more suggestible, and by that I mean with drugs. So if you give people LSD, yes, there's an altered state of consciousness, and yes, both work going back decades and more recent work by Parhat Harris in London has shown if you give people LSD and then suggestions, they respond more to those suggestions while under LSD. Cannabis has the same effect. Nitrous oxide, which is laughing gas, also increases suggestibility. We found at Sussex that if you get people to drink the equivalent of 2 pints very quickly, hypnotic suggestibility increases. Not all drugs increase suggestibility. Valium, for example, does not, but some drugs do. So altered states do exist, and you can increase suggestibility with them. But these are not unique hypnotic states. Right? So a hypnotic induction is not the same as taking an LSD tablet. So while there are altered states that increase suggestibility, that doesn't mean that a hypnotic induction induces an altered state that's causal in increasing suggestibility. Now, another claim I want to endorse is that subjects do feel like they're in an altered state, and in that sense they are in an altered state when you give a hypnotic induction and when you say to a highly hypnotizable subject, I want you to become deeply hypnotized. Yes, a highly hypnotizable person can then go into a state where they say, this is a different state than normal. They may report inward absorbed attention, relaxation, slowing of time. It's particularly common. But the question is this just another suggestion? I mean, a highly hypnotizable person is a person who's good at responding to suggestions, of creating experiences in themselves. That's just one of the skills that they have. They can create the experience of involuntariness in terms of the lifting their arm, or they can create the experience of seeing pink elephants. So if you give them the suggestion that they'll be in an altered state, and they have a view about what that altered state is, for example, involves slowing of time, relaxation, inward absorbed attention, maybe feeling a bit spacey, or whatever else it means to them, why wouldn't they be able to create that experience in themselves? So the altered state could just be another suggestion. So it's not causal in allowing that subject to respond to other suggestions. It's just one among many suggestions that that person can respond to. Now, so one question is, are there any components of experience that are common to the altered states that highly hypnotizable subjects produce in themselves or experience when it's suggested to them they'll be in an altered state? And are any of these experiences necessary or causal or facilitatory of responding to other suggestions? Well, in a PhD thesis, Henry found that people can have different expectations about subjective experience in hypnosis. So if you ask people, what do you think the hypnotic state involves, or trance state involves, it can involve time going faster or slower, logical thinking becoming easier or more difficult, external sounds becoming clearer or more muffled, are becoming more or less involved with things happening in the world. And what he found was the experiences that subjects had after hypnotic induction matched the preconceptions of what the trance state involved. So that would fit with the theory that the altered state is just another suggestion. And therefore, it matches what the person took the suggestion to be. So, if people, what that would imply is that there's nothing special about that. While subjects do go into altered states, they can put themselves in altered states as a particular suggestion that they're responding to. There'll be nothing special about those experiences that distinguish the hypnotic state from maybe any other state, because the hypnotic state is just what the subject takes it to be. Kirsch tested this in an experiment where he either gave hypnotizable subjects progressive relaxation, that is, you strip away the reference to hypnosis and you just get people to relax parts of the body. Now relax your hands, now relax your forearms, relax your shoulders, relax your chest, and so on. Or standard hypnotic induction. And then ask the subjects to report in an open-ended way, what are you experiencing? Please describe your experience of the state you're in as fully as you can. These transcripts were then sent to leading hypnosis experts, and they're asked, can you distinguish the experiential reports of subjects after hypnotic induction versus just relaxation? So the experts then sorted them out. If they were performing at chance, if you just sorted according to flip of a coin, you'd have 50% accuracy in your sorting. In fact, the judges were 48% accuracy, 48% accurate in classifying these subjective reports. That is, judges were at chance at whether the reports were indicating a putative state of hypnosis or just being relaxed. So let me draw some conclusions. Hypnotic induction caused small increases in suggestibility that, I say, can be accounted for by an increase in expectation. I mean, can in principle be. We can't say for sure whether the increase in expectation is the single defining explanation of this increase, but just that it could be. So we have a simple explanation for what inductions are doing. They increase motivation and expectation. Although, as I say, it might be more than that. It might be that the induction is letting the highly hypnotizable subject know that this is a context in which it's appropriate to go into that special state. There is no common characteristic of all hypnotic inductions, other than the subject believes they induce hypnosis. You can see on Amazon large volumes of different hypnotic inductions for different cases and different situations. You don't need all these different procedures. There's nothing a subject can do after an induction they could not do otherwise. Maybe they can do it a little bit better. That's still a matter of controversy, but we are talking about a small bit. There are no established physiological or other markers that uniquely pick out a hypnotic state. We just haven't found them yet. I'm not saying they're not there, but we've looked and we haven't found them yet. So there isn't a consensus. I don't want you to go away from the lecture thinking that all the experts agree on this. But the conclusions I just gave are quite straightforward. And so one conclusion is being in an altered state is just one of the suggestions the subject responds to. That's what I take to be maybe the simplest story of what's going on. And maybe the altered state plays no causal role in responding to further suggestions. I just offer that as I think maybe the simplest explanation of what's going on, but not the only possible one. And this issue is still hotly debated, with some people saying there is a special state that will improve ability to respond by that small amount. Now, so while I tend to err on the side of saying there is no special trance state, yes, subjects go into an altered state, but that's just another suggestion that they're responding to. It's not causal in terms of allowing them to respond further to suggestion. I am not thereby debunking hypnosis. Remember, I started by saying there are sort of two components to hypnosis. There's the issue of a trance or altered state, but there's also the issue of responding to suggestion. And even if we say there's no special hypnotic causal state, there's still the issue of the altered experiences that highly hypnotizable people can create in themselves to do with volition and sense of reality. Now, just to finish with, I want to indicate that what I take to be hypnotic effects occur in other contexts, which aren't defined as hypnosis, where no special induction is involved. So, this is rather loud. This is a keymaster who, without touching his students, can project key and make them respond in an involuntary way, experience pain, do backflips, stop them breathing. I look at that and say that's hypnosis. And both parties can believe what's going on is genuine because they have genuine experiences. So the student flipping over, he really experiences that. He really experiences the pain, the involuntary actions, because that's what happens when you respond to hypnotic suggestion. So the master believes it. So what the master did was he challenged anyone, cage fighter, anyone who wants to come and fight him, because he genuinely believes it. And why wouldn't he? So it's, what did it say, $5,000? $500? Anyway, a lot of money on the line. Someone steps up, I think it was a karate guy, and says, all right, let's have a go. Now, the trouble with hypnotic suggestions is, as we saw in the previous lecture, they're not going to work if you don't want them to work, even if you're highly hypnotizable. That's why they wouldn't really work very well in an alleyway with someone trying to attack you. So if it's a hypnotic suggestion that's going on here, then the key master isn't going to be able to do much with the karate master who doesn't want to respond to the hypnosis. Right? But the key master is quite willing to go ahead with it because he genuinely believes in his ability to project key. So we start. So he's summoning his key. The karate guy is slightly wary at first. No, didn't feel that key shot. It was a bit of a surprise. And you say, "Are you sure you want to carry on?" And I think the key master's rather surprised now, got a sore nose. And he's probably thinking, all right, just need to warm up, get the key going. But he does carry on. But it doesn't last much longer. And I'm afraid that's the end of it. So for me, you can see hypnosis in all sorts of contexts, and we'll talk about that more in next lecture. And you see, in these contexts, we don't need inductions. We just need belief, expectation, and for the person to understand this is an appropriate time to use your hypnotic skills. All right, thanks very much. See you next week.